As cities across Ukraine face a second day of airstrikes, the Ukrainian president calls on leaders of the G7 to give Ukraine more air defense capabilities. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. Leaders with the G7 held an emergency virtual meeting on Tuesday after Moscow carried out its largest assault on Ukraine in months. The G7 leaders pledged more financial and military support to Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy. Russian President Vladimir Putin said the airstrikes were in response to the attack on a vital bridge that serves as a supply route between Russia and Crimea. On Tuesday, the Russian president also met with the International Atomic Energy chief Rafael Grossi about the nuclear plant in Zaporizhzhia that Russian forces control. The UN nuclear agency is pushing for Kyiv and Moscow to agree to a demilitarized zone around the nuclear plant. For more now on the Russia-Ukraine conflict, let's bring in our panel. Joining us from Kyiv is Mychailo Wynnyckyj. He's a professor with Kyiv-Mohyla Academy and author of Ukraine's Maidan, Russia's War, a Chronicle and Analysis of the Revolution of Dignity. Also with us from London, Michael Bradshaw is a professor of global energy at the Warwick Business School. Here in Washington, D.C., Anton Fedyashin is a professor of history at American University. And from Moscow, Mark Sloboda is an international affairs and security analyst. Welcome to all of you. Mark Sloboda, let me start with you. The Russian response to the bombing of that Kyiv bridge, which links Russia with Crimea, has been swift and deadly. 19 Ukrainians have died and more than 100 wounded in a wave of Russian bomb attacks. Here is President Putin.
In case of continuing attempts at terrorist attacks on our territory, Russia's responses will be severe and will correspond in scale to the level of threats created for the Russian Federation. No one must doubt it.
So, Mark, we've also had a response from the French President, Emmanuel Macron. He described this latest turn of events as, quote, a profound change in the nature of this war. What's it looking like from Moscow? How has this war changed?
Well, we've seen an escalation, right? We have seen an escalation in that the Kiev regime and then their Western backers by default have made infrastructure a legitimate target. And the Crimean Bridge, of course, was not the first time. Kiev regime forces have been shelling electrical and other infrastructure in the Donbass for 8 years. They have also bragged about shelling electrical infrastructure across the border from Kharkov into Russia, into Belgorod, where they have numerous times targeted the electrical infrastructure there. So now Russia is responding, as is their wont with their capabilities, in a much larger and more systemic way. And the Russian strikes, well, first of all, the first target was buildings, offices, headquarters of the Ukrainian intelligence services, the SBU, which orchestrated, according to the Ukrainian press, the car bombing truck bombing on the Kerch Bridge. But as well the assassination of Daria Dugin in Moscow and other of crimes, really. The second target was electrical transformer substations and key railroad junctions. And these are meant to logistically inhibit the Kiev regime from moving troops around the country.
Mychailo Wynnyckyj, what do you make of this turn of events? I mean, we are seeing civilian infrastructure now being hit, and of course, Ukraine and Ukrainians have been on the receiving end of these Russian attacks over the past 48 hours. As I said, 19 Ukrainians have died, more than 100 have been injured. What's it looking like in Ukraine?
Well, frankly, absolutely nothing like what my previous guest what my colleague from Russia has just said. Ukrainians have not been attacking anything that comes even close to Russian infrastructure when it comes. And by the way, it's not Russian infrastructure; it happens to be Ukrainian infrastructure because the Russians have invaded Ukraine, and therefore anything that is in the Donbass obviously is within Ukraine, and Ukrainians are quite successfully counterattacking against the Russian army. The statement about the fact that supposedly the SBU or any other government buildings were attacked or even targeted, I'll point out that over the last 2 days, we've had over 50 residential apartment blocks that have been damaged or destroyed by Russian missiles, and only 2 administrative buildings. In other words, if the Russians were aiming for administrative buildings, they failed dramatically. We've had children's playgrounds bombed. We've had residential buildings bombed. We've had universities and schools and kindergartens bombed. At the end of the day, to state that this is a retaliation for the Crimean Bridge, well, frankly, there has been absolutely no evidence of the fact that the Ukrainians are responsible for the Crimean Bridge disaster. I welcome the fact that the Russians have come to this conclusion within literally 24 hours of the disaster happening, but it certainly looks like the Russians, having planned a massive rocket attack on Ukraine for the last 2 weeks, needed some sort of a pretext to attack it, and therefore basically attack their own bridge.
All right, Mychailo. Mark, what's your response to that?
I mean, this sad, really sad propaganda, which I am quite sure that the viewers of CGTN are far too intelligent to buy. We've heard this repeatedly over the last 8 years. The people of East Ukraine, where I have family, have been bombing themselves for the last 8 years. Russian forces in the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant have been bombing themselves in an attempt to blow themselves up in a nuclear explosion. The Russian Nord Stream pipelines, the Russians blew up their own $30 billion pipeline. Now the sick denialist propaganda from this regime apologists would have us believe that the Russians blew up their own bridge, when the Ukrainska Pravda newspaper itself in Kiev recounted regime officials saying that the SBU was behind this terrorist attack.
Okay, I want to move on.
There's no words.
Right, I want to move on. Anton Fedyashin, there's been some changes in the Russian military leadership as well. The Russian General Sergei Surovikin has now been appointed commander of all of Russian forces in Ukraine, and his brief, we understand, is to reinvigorate the Russian effort on the battlefield, and that is after Russia suffered setbacks and territorial losses. What can you tell us about his appointment and what this means for this conflict?
Well, this looks like the Russians are getting ready for a fall, potentially of a winter offensive, because they have given up territory, all of which has been very well covered. In the Kharkiv region, they've lost several villages and a good chunk of territory along the Dnieper in the Kherson region. They've withdrawn their forces. They decided to trade territory for the lives of their soldiers. And the question is, how will they approach an attempt to recapture this territory if that is what they are looking to do? Now, this is the first time, Surovikin's appointment is the first time that there is a unified local command structure being created by the Russians, because until now, the war effort has primarily been run by the general staff. And it certainly looks like the Russians are preparing for something big, especially given that they are awaiting the roughly 300,000 newly mobilized reserves. Now, when this counteroffensive to the Ukrainian counteroffensive will begin, I assume that it will be in the next 2, 3, at the latest 4 weeks. So we'll see how it goes.
Michael Bradshaw, welcome to the show. As I said earlier on, leaders of the G7 countries have been meeting in emergency session. It was a virtual meeting, and it was addressed virtually by the Ukrainian leader, Volodymyr Zelenskyy. And in that address, he asked for more assistance, specifically for more air defense systems. Let's listen to what he had to say.
I am asking you to strengthen the overall effort to help financially with the creation of an air shield for Ukraine. Millions of people will be grateful to the Group of Seven for such assistance.
So, Michael, here we have a situation where the Ukrainians want more air defense systems. They also want longer-range missiles, missiles that could target positions inside Russia, and the Germans have also said that they would accelerate the delivery of an infrared-guided air defense system. Where do you see all of this going?
Well, I'm an expert on energy markets, not on military strategy, and it sounds to me like you have some of your other speakers who are better qualified to answer that question than I. I mean, the kind of requests that Ukraine is now making, I guess, makes sense in face of the threats that they now are facing. And Western leaders and G7 have committed all along to do what they can. So we must wait and see. But as I say, I'm not an expert in this area.
Okay, well, let's talk about something that you are an expert in, and that is energy markets. Are you surprised that the G7 has not addressed the fact that energy supplies around the world are being affected by this conflict, and the longer it continues, the worse the situation gets?
Well, I'm not sure it's true that they haven't addressed it. I mean, the G7 has been discussing the possibility of an oil price cap to try and reduce the amount of income that Russia is generating from oil exports. But we're still waiting to hear on the details of how that might operate. And that has been triggered in part because of the next round of sanctions from the European Union will see a ban on seaborne deliveries of Russian crude oil. So I think there's discussion there is moving forward, and we would expect in the next few days, if not weeks, a concrete proposal on oil price caps. But it's very difficult to intervene in a market such as oil, a fungible commodity. The oil will find other ways to market, no doubt. And of course, it's also against the backdrop of an OPEC plus production cut. So what all this is doing is probably adding greater volatility to an already volatile market.
Mark Sloboda, there's been a great deal of speculation in the Western media, particularly here in the United States, over the possible use of nuclear weapons in this conflict. The Russian Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov, has been talking about that. He tried to clarify the situation. This is what he had to say. Let's listen.
The Russian president has said repeatedly that our nuclear doctrine stipulates exclusive retaliatory measures intended to prevent the destruction of the Russian Federation as a result of direct nuclear strikes or the use of other weapons that threaten the very existence of the Russian state.
Now, Mark, the United States President Joe Biden, he has expressed concerns that if this conflict continues to go poorly, as he says, then President Putin could resort to nuclear weapons. What is the situation on nuclear weapons?
Yeah, I think there is a real threat of nuclear weapon use in this conflict. I believe it is very possible that the United States or the regime that it backs in Kiev will use a nuclear weapon or a dirty bomb to try to create a false flag incident to blame Russia in order to create the extremist political conditions to facilitate perhaps not a NATO, but a U.S.-Polish direct military incursion into Western Ukraine. I think what we're seeing with this disinformation campaign about a Russian use of very specifically tactical nuclear weapons, when the Russian president has said absolutely nothing of the sort, and this has been completely distorted quite maliciously by the Western media when the Russian president said he would use any means at his disposal to defend the Russian people and Russia. I think it's narrative frame building. This is what is going on here. We have already seen the Kiev regime launch months of artillery shelling and kamikaze suicide drone attacks on the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, particularly on the spent fuel containers, in exactly the intent to create such a dirty bomb incident. And I believe that with the change in the Russian rules of engagement, the calling up of reserves, and if this conflict looks to be going against Kiev in the next year and a half in a very serious way, I think there is nothing that they won't stop at. We've heard that from the NATO Secretary General, that NATO must defeat Russia in this conflict, acknowledging that it is NATO at war with Russia.
All right, let me go to Mychailo on that point. Mychailo, let's look at this, or the status of the conflict right now from the Ukrainian point of view. President Zelenskyy, he has said that the Ukrainian military has retaken hundreds of square miles of territory that was occupied by Russia, and he also said that dozens of towns, villages in the southern Kherson region have also been retaken by Ukrainian troops. Now, we have winter approaching. We're also seeing this conflict escalate in quite a big way. I mean, does Ukraine believe that it will prevail militarily on the battlefield, that it will win this through battle?
The answer to that one is yes. The area around Kherson, specifically, I have close family in Novakhovka. They are waiting to be liberated. There is a significant amount of Ukrainians that are not a significant amount. Everybody is there waiting to be to have the Russian invader leave. I'm surprised by the statements that Mark just made about the fact that the Russian president has stated supposedly that nuclear weapons will never be used. The Russian president, I'll remind you, in January also said that Ukraine would never be invaded. But unfortunately, the Russian president's word is not very good. Ukraine was invaded. 20% of Ukrainian land at this point is under occupation. A little less, actually, as of 4 weeks ago, because the Ukrainian counterattack began, and we took back about, as was stated, about 2% of our land, 2 or 3%. So the reality is that this particular bombing that has happened over the last couple of days has been a response to the fact that the war is going badly for Russia. It's going extraordinarily badly for Russia. Now, what is the response of a terrorist? They begin to bomb children's playgrounds. They begin to go after nuclear. They begin to talk about nuclear blackmail. They will continue to do the kinds of genocides that we've seen in Bucha and Mariupol and in various other places. But most importantly, they've gone after energy infrastructure, which has nothing to do with military objectives. And I'll remind you that the military objective was supposedly to change the regime in Kyiv. Now, why should I and 40 million other Ukrainians sit in the dark and have a problem with heating in the wintertime in order for the Russians to change the regime in Kyiv is a mystery to me. The reality is that this is terrorism against the population.
Okay, Mark, doesn't Mychailo have a valid point there? Why is Russia going... Yeah, go ahead.
No, he doesn't.
Yeah.
I'm afraid that my colleague knows absolutely nothing about either military matters or Ukraine's own energy network. The trains in Ukraine run on electricity, right? And the trains are the principal means which the regime uses to get both troops and military equipment across the country. Some 90% of movements beyond a local area are with this. So therefore, inhibiting the regime to use their rail networks is a principal tactical advantage in this conflict, which makes it a very legitimate target, just like when the U.S. bombs Iraq or Libya or so forth, they target the electrical infrastructure first.
Okay, I want to go to Anton. Anton, Mychailo just told us that this war is going very badly for Russia. Is it?
Well, it hasn't been going very well in terms of the territorial hold that the Russians have had. But listen, as I said earlier, I think it's a little too early to declare victory for the Ukrainians, unfortunately, because what the Russians have done is, in a sense, uncharacteristic in the grand scheme of Russian-Soviet history. Instead of making pointless last stands over towns like Izum and the steppe down in Kherson, they've actually withdrawn their forces and saved them for what looks like preparation for a battle ahead. The Russians are also mobilizing forces. Nothing strategic has so far changed to address the fundamental imbalance in this war between Russia's strategic reach into Ukrainian territory and the absence of an equal and opposite reach into Russian territory. Russian territory proper for the Ukrainians. So the fundamental imbalance is still there. And if the Ukrainians manage to sustain the effort on the ground that they had maintained for the past several weeks, then of course the war is going to go their way. But look, as any military expert who's serious will tell you, logistics and sustainability is the key to success.
Right.
And the death toll on the Ukrainian side, and I follow the Ukrainian chats and channels, has been staggering, both in Kherson and in Kharkiv. And so we'll have to wait and see how things develop in the fall. I'm not terribly optimistic.
One other thing, Anton, of course, there is a diplomatic dimension to all of this as well. And if you could be brief, the United Nations General Assembly met on Monday to debate a proposed resolution that would condemn Russia for its claim to the 4 territories in Ukraine. Russia, in fact, asked later for a secret ballot to be held, but that was rejected in subsequent votes by the General Assembly. What impact, if any, will this have on what Russia is trying to do?
So let's start with the request for a secret vote. I'm not sure why the Russians even bothered and wasted their time, because that was going to be shut down very quickly. But having said that, listen, the UN General Assembly is going to vote against recognizing this annexation. That's a given, because the same thing happened with the Crimea in 2014. And frankly, I don't think this is going to be very important for Moscow. They're not asking for international recognition of newly independent territories such as Kosovo, which is also not recognized internationally. They're not asking for embassies to be placed there. None of these regions, which they don't actually fully control anyway, are going to be brought into international organizations. The Russians see this as a domestic internal affair, so the UN vote, in the larger scheme of things, is not going to matter to Moscow.
Michael Bradshaw, this conflict is taking a heavy toll on NATO's European members. Their economies are struggling in large part because of the cuts in energy from Russia. And there are many people who believe that the Eurozone is already in some kind of a recession. The President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, has been talking about the energy crisis, and this is what she had to say. Let's listen.
All these views on the gas market, the electricity prices, are so important, because we have to keep our single market together and we have to avoid fragmentation. I emphasize once again how crucial that is, and this is an opinion that was widely shared. Time and again, the single market has proven to be our single best asset in times of crisis.
So, Michael, as European leaders sit down to look at how they can overcome this, what are their options right now?
Well, they've already been introducing a number of measures over the summer in terms of trying to reduce energy demand, particularly gas demand, over the coming months. They've worked hard to support the delivery of liquefied natural gas into Europe to fill Europe's storage. So ahead of the winter, the storage levels are well above 80–85%. So that stands them in good stead. I mean, as was being implied there's been considerable work among member states around the European single energy market, talking about mechanisms to make sure that works as an integrated market, that there is trade between members, there are no barriers to the movement of electricity or gas, in the spirit of solidarity. And of course, on the customer side of things, member states have been doing a lot to introduce packages, some more than others, to support and protect customers as a result of the price spikes. That's also true outside of the European Union. In the UK, we've had a very significant package of financial support to help with the winter. So there are a number of things which are being done. There's a lot of discussion, a lot of suggestions as to, for example, how they may look at electricity market reform to try and reduce the impact of the very high gas price on the price that people pay for electricity from other sources. So there's an awful lot of activity going on behind the scenes, a lot of discussion. And I think really the idea, certainly within the European Union, that it is easier for any one member state to deal with this through cooperation and through solidarity remains very much the case.
From what I'm hearing, Michael, it appears that there is no short-term fix, that this energy crisis could go on perhaps for quite a few years.
That's certainly true. I mean, the scale of the readjustment is very significant. If you think back to 2021, Russian pipeline gas was meeting 40% of Europe's domestic consumption. There's still been a significant amount of gas flowing into Europe this year. That's helped to fill storage. There's a limited amount of liquefied natural gas available on global markets to replace that Russian pipeline gas. So all being well, it's weather dependent as much as anything, but a lot of other factors need to be in Europe's favor. We may get through this winter. But if we are in a situation where no further gas is going to flow in significant volumes from Russia, then preparing for next winter is going to be more difficult. We have demand destruction taking place where where industry is shutting down and not consuming gas because of very high prices. Unfortunately, we have many households facing energy poverty because they can't afford to heat their homes.
Mark, on the question of gas supplies to Europe, if we go back to the bombing of the Nord Stream pipelines, there's been a development. Sweden says it will not allow Russia to participate in its ongoing investigation into the cause of these blasts and, of course, the multiple leaks that we've seen from these pipelines. It says, Sweden says, Moscow is free to carry out its own inspection of the pipeline. What is Russia going to do about that?
Russia will make a lot of noise. There really is nothing they can do. I'm sure that they will carry out their own investigation, and the primary suspects who carried out will conduct their own, and there will be no consequence. Germany is still obliged by contract to pay for gas that would have been delivered by Nord Stream. So they will still have to pay the Russian government anyway. The Kremlin's coffers are full. They're running a $51 billion budget surplus. And Russia's working very hard to redivert long-term its gas, coal, and oil supplies to the east, to reliable consumers that aren't involved in economic warfare and geopolitical conflicts with Russia. They will find no shortage of buyers. Europe will pay 4 times as much for a fraction of the gas that they were getting. And we have had the EU Chief Borrell admit today that European prosperity has been built on cheap, reliable Russian gas. Yes. And the area of that prosperity is over.
Mychailo, I've only got a minute left, but right now in Washington, we are seeing the annual fall meetings of the IMF and World Bank, and officials are expected to release a very bleak report on the world economy. Global recession appears inevitable. Experts I talked to on this very show says a priority right now, as far as the world is concerned, is to reach a negotiated settlement to the conflict in Ukraine. And the fact that we are seeing this energy crisis in Europe and around the world could force leaders to rethink pursuing this conflict in Ukraine. Are the Ukrainians, how deeply concerned are the Ukrainians, I should say, about the fact that support for this conflict might weaken, might fracture because of the domestic conditions they're facing?
Look, everyone understands that this is going to be a very difficult winter. We need to understand why it's going to be a difficult winter. The reason is because we have an aggressive, imperialist neighbor in the Kremlin who decided to make this winter very difficult. There is no other reason for this. Now, as far as the Ukrainians are concerned, it's very simple. Ukrainians will continue to fight until such time as the aggressor, the invader, has been removed from our territory. In other words, there will be no deal without Ukraine. And this is not a war of the West versus Russia. This is Russia invading Ukraine. And Ukraine has a responsibility to its own people, to its government, and everything else to get Russia out. Simple as that.
And we have to leave it there. Well, thanks to all of you for being with us on the show. And that's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Arnold Naidoo in Washington, D.C. Thank you for watching.